Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like-minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but 2 of my last 3 trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company, again, is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler, and thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler, episode 79. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to Ethiopia.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. 15-hour flight, I don't think I'll ever be coming home. You know I love it. I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. I have 2 travel stories for you today. The first one is an article from National Geographic Traveler, and I'll put links to both stories on the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. The first one is called 51 Ways to Cut Vacation Costs, and it goes through a number of different things that you can do to save money, from simple things like joining AAA and taking some advantage of some of their discounts, to more subtle things like clearing your cookies from your browser because you'll get a different rate when you go back to some sites based on what you have bought before. So check out that article and see what you think of those suggestions. National Geographic Traveler is one of my favorite travel magazines, and I'm sure it's only coincidental that they mentioned the podcast last year. In the second news story, Dave Barry is always been one of my favorite comedy writers. He has not necessarily been one of my favorite travel writers because he doesn't generally write about travel, but he did write a review of a recent trip to St. Bart's that you might find interesting if you're heading to that island nation. It's titled, If You Can Tip $17,000, This is the Island for You. So take a look at that link and the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome back to the show Chris Willis. Chris was on the show earlier, for those of you who've been listening for a while, and did one of my favorite episodes, which was Swimming with Whales in Tonga. And he's come back to talk this time about Ethiopia. Chris, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate the opportunity to be on with you again.
Now, this is, we say we're talking about Ethiopia, but this is part of a larger trip. I think we're going to do this probably in a couple different sections. You went to Ethiopia and then also to Rwanda and Uganda.
Right. It was a 1-week trip in Ethiopia, followed by about a week and a half in Uganda and Rwanda.
Now, those are not your typical destinations. Why these three countries? And why Ethiopia in particular right now?
Well, the trip was planned initially as a guerrilla trekking trip, which is why we went to Uganda and Rwanda. And that didn't fill up the amount of time that we had to take off. So my wife and I started looking for other things that were sort of in the neighborhood that we could do either before or after that. And Ethiopia came to our attention because it's a African country that's relatively near where we were going to be. It's in Eastern Africa. It has a big airport hub in Addis Ababa from which you can easily fly to other countries in Africa. And it has a very unique culture and history and isn't visited by very many tourists. So those things all attracted us to it, and that's the reason we initially decided to go there.
And let's start with, what was the highlight of the trip?
I would have to say that among the 5 cities that we visited in Ethiopia, which were Addis Ababa, Bahir Dar, Gondar, Aksum, and Lalibela, Lalibela was the best to us because it's set in an incredible landscape of gorgeous mountains. The town of Lalibela itself is at 8,200 feet, so it's way up in the mountains. And it's a very small town, but has a series of 11 churches that are carved out of stone. And a lot of the churches are actually carved down into the bedrock so that the roof of the church is at ground level. It's got sort of a trench carved in stone around it, and then the church is carved from the ground up out of a single piece of bedrock. And, some of them are 30 or 45 feet tall, and they're intricately carved with windows and designs on them, and all of them were carved in the 12th century. And to see those was really the highlight of our trip to Ethiopia, I think.
Now, you've done a fair amount of research, it sounds like, on this trip. Why are they carving churches out of one large piece of stone?
According to the legends, the king of Ethiopia at the time, whose name was Lalibela, the town is now named after him. At his time, the town was actually called Roha. He claimed that God had appeared to him in a dream and commanded him to build these churches in that manner. So that's what he did.
And these are
local legend, by the way, has it that the churches were carved out of stone with the assistance of angels.
All right. And these are Coptic Christian churches?
Well, Ethiopia is an Orthodox Christian country, at least the part of it that we were in is.
Oh, it's Orthodox. I didn't realize that.
They're not Coptic Christians in the same way that you would find perhaps in Egypt.
Sure.
They have their own unique brand of Christianity because Ethiopia had formerly controlled some areas of the Horn of Africa along the sea and had regular contact with ancient Rome and other ancient civilizations. But when the Arabs took over North Africa, they surrounded Ethiopia and took over all of the coastal areas that Ethiopia previously had controlled and really cut them off from the outside world. So they had converted to Christianity by then, but didn't have further communication with other European or Mediterranean civilizations that were Christian at the time. And so Ethiopia really went in its own direction from the standpoint of Christianity. So its brand of Christianity is unique in that respect. And very heavily influenced by both Islam and Judaism, because they were surrounded by Muslims who they generally were getting along with, and they had a substantial Jewish population in the country as well.
Interesting. As you're in Lalibela and you're in these churches, what was the first surprise? What stands out from those for you?
Well, the surprise of the construction of the churches themselves, the surprise that even though the churches are going on 900 years old, they're still in active use by the local population. There's priests in all of them. There's artifacts like paintings and crosses in all of them. And there's people around them who are coming to participate in church services or to receive a blessing from the priest or something like that. So they're unlike other ancient buildings that you see in places, for example, like Egypt, which are no longer living buildings in the sense that they're not used anymore. These are still used every day for religious services and ceremonies, and that was something that I didn't realize before we went, but I was very glad to find.
Interesting. Anything else about Lalibela that really comes to mind as you think about that part of the trip?
Well, certainly another highlight of Lalibela is the opportunity to go to a nearby mountaintop monastery. It's called Asheton Mariam. It's a church that's carved into a cave at the top of the highest mountain that's near Lalibela. And it involves a pretty strenuous climb from 8,200 to a little over 10,000 feet up a kind of steep, rocky trail. You can hire a mule to carry you up there if you like. But the scenery on the way up to that church is astonishing. You get a great panoramic view of the entire nearby area and the town as well. The church itself is very interesting also. But if you like, seeing outdoors and seeing, beautiful panoramic landscapes, that's a little excursion that can be done in half a day that I would highly recommend to anybody.
Now, you were in Ethiopia in July.
No, we were there in December.
You were there in December. Okay. You told me,
Right.
but I couldn't remember.
Yeah, we arrived on Christmas Eve and left on New Year's Eve.
Oh, interesting. Why that time of the year?
Well, we had picked the trip, again, to coincide with the best season, we thought, for gorilla viewing, and that happened to be the dry season in that part of Ethiopia as well. The central Ethiopian plateau has a very distinct rainy and dry season. Mm-hmm. During the rainy season, it rains a lot there, like 12 or 13 inches of rain in a month. During the dry season, there's no rain at all. The climate is very pleasant. It's about 75 degrees during the day and maybe 55 at night. And so that worked out for the timing of our trip to Ethiopia as well because we had great weather the whole time.
Oh, okay. What else stands out as a surprise from Ethiopia?
I think the other thing that really surprised us was the how much we enjoyed the castles in Gondar, which is another city in northern Ethiopia. It was the capital of Ethiopia in the 17th century, and the king of Ethiopia at that time, named Fasilides, built a series of castles along with his successors in the city Gondar, and they're very European in style, although they certainly have unique elements to them. Sometimes people refer to Gondar as the Camelot of Ethiopia because of the resemblance of those castles to ones that you find in Western Europe. And, there's a huge complex of them. Most of them are in pretty good condition. A few were damaged during some fighting with the Italians during the occupation of World War II, but most of them are in pretty good shape, and there are lots of them, and they make for really interesting things to explore and great things to take pictures of. And we were there for, several hours and saw maybe 3 other tourists the entire time we were there. Because Ethiopia is not a very popular place for large numbers of tourists yet. And one of the great things was almost all the sites we visited, there would be only a handful of tourists at most. And in fact, we kept seeing the same people as we went from city to city. We ran into the same people over and over again because they were doing the same route that we are. And that was kind of neat. It gives you the sense of discovering a secret that only a few people know about. That's one of the charms of Ethiopia to me.
Now, why not that many tourists? My impression is that Ethiopia is relatively stable for African countries these days.
I think that's probably accurate. They have not had a government change since about 1990, and there hasn't been any fighting within Ethiopia for a long time. So I think stability and security are relatively good. The reason that I would probably posit to you as the explanation for why they don't get a lot of tourists is they're really not set up for it. The towns, there certainly are nice hotels in Addis Ababa, which is a city of probably 8 million people, and it's the capital of Ethiopia. But once you get outside of Addis, the facilities for tourism are very underdeveloped. The hotels are not particularly nice. The service isn't great. There's not that many tour companies doing tours of Ethiopia, although we did go with a tour company. We didn't try to do it on ourselves. You can't get around by road very easily. The roads are not very good between the towns, so you either have to fly or you have to endure some fairly long road trips. And, there's a hassle factor involved with going there, not unlike what you'd get probably going places like Egypt or something like that. In fact, it was very similar to Egypt in our experience in that you've got a lot of people who will come up to you and ask for money or try to sell you something or whatever. And you've got to have a traveler with a certain kind of constitution to be able to stay in a less than great hotel and deal with a lot of people coming up to you and asking you for money or whatever. So I would say those are probably the reasons why it hasn't mushroomed more quickly as a tourist destination. With that having been said, I think they're making active efforts to try to promote it and to improve the tourist infrastructure there. But for now, I think it's going to remain relatively unvisited by tourists until they really do some things to improve its appeal from a mass market scale.
And when you say the hotels are less than great, that's a polite way of saying what? We always joke that my wife's idea of roughing it is a black and white TV and slow room service. You're talking a little lower than that, I'm gathering.
Yeah, definitely. So, in these towns in the Northern Historical Loop, which is what the set of towns that we visited is called, they're all owned by the Ethiopian government, and they were built during the communist era. They all look the same. The rooms are very small. They only have twin beds. A lot of them are in areas with water shortages, particularly during the dry season. Mm-hmm. So the water's only on for a few hours a day. There's only hot water available for a couple of hours a day. The service at the restaurants is very slow. The level of cleanliness is probably not what you would expect from a nice hotel in the United States. You probably wouldn't find yourself inspired to want to jump in there and take a shower in the bathroom. They don't have any kind of climate control in them whatsoever, which is really not that big of a problem because the weather is so nice there. And there's no TV, of course. There may be a TV in the lobby showing CNN International, but that's about it. The food is not great. It'll keep you alive, and we didn't have any problems with it, but it wasn't very tasty. So those are the kinds of things that I would say to you as the reasons for why I would describe the hotels as less than optimal.
And what is the food like, Ethiopian food?
Well, first off, if you stay at these hotels, you don't eat Ethiopian food. They serve their interpretation of Western dishes. So they'll have fried fish or spaghetti or things like that. The way that they make it, though, they don't seem to have caught on to how to do it and make it taste right. So a lot of the things are very tasteless and bland. Now, if you do eat traditional Ethiopian food, the staple of it is a bread that they make from a local grain called teff, and the bread is called injera. And it's a big, flat, kind of brown, spongy, thin piece of bread. They put that on a plate, and then they put various meat, like lamb or fish or chicken or whatever on it. Usually it's very spicy, and then they have various vegetables and things. And then they give you other, rolled up pieces of this same bread, injera, and you tear a piece off the bread and grab some meat or vegetables or whatever you're going to eat in the bread and then eat with your hands. And that's the way traditional Ethiopian food is eaten. We had eaten at some Ethiopian restaurants here in Atlanta before we went, so we knew what to expect from that. Mm-hmm. I'm not a big fan of Ethiopian food, but I'm a picky eater anyway, so that's not saying anything. But in the hotels that the government runs, they really do concentrate on Western-type food. You can only get traditional Ethiopian food if you specially request it in advance.
And did you try the honey wine also?
No, I didn't even see any of that. Okay. I'm not sure where I would have found it.
That's something we had tried at a local Ethiopian restaurant here in San Jose.
Okay. Yeah, nobody offered it to us, and so no, we didn't try it.
So what do you wish you'd known before you went? You did a lot of preparation, so you knew a lot of stuff before you got there.
Yeah, I think I probably wish I had paid more attention to my travel book when it described the hassle factor that I was talking about a few minutes ago. Mm-hmm. It's easy to get into Ethiopia and feel a little beset by a lot of people following you around and talking to you and coming up to you. And I think I wish I would have prepared more psychologically for that element of it. That was probably the one piece of planning I wish I had done that I didn't.
Okay. What did the tour books recommend that you thought was disappointing?
I wasn't super impressed by anything we saw in Bahir Dar, which is our first stop. It's everybody's first stop when they do the Northern Historical Circuit, because that's the route that the airline flies. There's only one airline that flies there, Ethiopian Airlines, and they fly the circuit in a particular order that dictates how most tourists do it. Bahir Dar was not that impressive to us overall. And the two main tourist attractions are there's a big waterfall there called the Blue Nile Falls. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. It's a nice waterfall, but it doesn't have the commanding presence of a Victoria Falls, for example. And then there is a series of ancient 1600s or so vintage churches on islands and on the shore of a big lake that's there by Bahir Dar, Lake Tana, which is about a 60-mile wide lake. And those churches are sort of interesting, but honestly don't have anything to offer, I don't think, that you wouldn't see elsewhere like Gondar or Lalibela. So I would say that Bahir Dar was probably the least favorite of our destinations in northern Ethiopia.
Okay. And the flip side of that, what things did you discover that were not in the tour books? You're on a tour, so you're a little limited in terms of that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a private tour, so it was just us and our guide, but we had a set itinerary, which we participated in setting before the trip, and we set it based primarily on the advice that we received from the best tour book for Ethiopia, which is the Brat Guide by Philip Briggs, which is very good, by the way. And everybody who you see in northern Ethiopia is walking around with that book in their hand.
Okay.
We didn't see many Lonely Planet books. We saw a lot of Brat Guides, and I think that says something, because normally we see a lot of Lonely Planet books.
Sure.
Normally that's what we use. So I wouldn't say that we really discovered anything that wasn't in that travel book, because it's so comprehensive and thorough.
Interesting. If people were to go to Ethiopia, what would you recommend what should they know before we go, the other listeners here?
Well, I think that they would need to determine that they're the right kind of traveler to go there, and primarily that refers to being able to tolerate the conditions that I was mentioning. If it's okay with you to rough it, and it doesn't bother you to see poverty and be around a place where people are coming up to you and asking you for money. Ethiopia had a recent war with Eritrea, so people who have war injuries will come up to you and ask you for money, among others. Children actively participate in that as well. You need to first determine that you're the kind of traveler who's not bothered by that. It didn't terribly bother me, and it was well worth it, in my view, to see the incredible sights that we saw there, and to have the opportunity to see some things that a lot of tourists don't get a chance to see. But it really takes, I think, that mentality of traveler to enjoy a visit to Ethiopia. And so that's the first thing I would say to anybody who's considering a trip there.
Okay. And mentioning the war with Eritrea, that reminds me, you were there when they were invading Somalia? Yes,
they invaded Somalia while I was there. You got to keep in mind that the part of Ethiopia that's most popular for tourism is the central northern Ethiopian plateau, the place where we were. And it's got to be 500 or 600 miles away from the Somali border. So there was no effect whatsoever of that conflict on our trip. Maybe there was a little bit of enhanced security at the airports, but, and we knew what was going on because it was on CNN International in the lobbies of the hotels and people were talking about it, but it had zero effect on our trip. It wasn't an issue at all.
Anything else we should know before we pack our bags and head off to Ethiopia?
Well, what I probably would do is mention a couple of the places we didn't go in Ethiopia, because having only a week there, we necessarily had to cut our trip short and didn't do all the things that we might otherwise have done if we had devoted a full 2 or 3 weeks to it. And there are a couple of tourist attractions there that people should know about because they appeal to, a certain type of traveler. One is an area called the Simien Mountains, which is near Gondar in the northern part of Ethiopia. But it's a really spectacular set of mountains that's very popular with trekkers and campers. And you can go there and go trekking and camping, and the hiking and views are supposed to be incredible there. They also have what's said to be the world's most endangered mammal predator, which is the Simien Mountain wolf. They have a species of wolf there that's very rare, and there's a unique species of baboon that lives there as well. The other place in Ethiopia that I heard a lot of other people talking about was the Omo River Valley, which is in the far south of Ethiopia, close to the border with Kenya. And the attraction of going there is you can visit there and visit people who don't have very much contact with the outside world and whose culture is relatively unchanged from what it's been for the last however many thousand years. They're ethnically distinct from the Ethiopians who are in the northern part. And I met a number of travelers who indicated that was their favorite part of Ethiopia. So that would be a place to consider if you have more time there.
And Addis Ababa, any particular highlights from, that's I think the one place we didn't talk about that you were at?
Yeah, unfortunately, because of our tight time schedule, we only had about half a day in Addis and didn't get to even do the things that we wanted to do because it was a public holiday. There's a national museum there that contains the remnants of the Lucy skeleton that was unearthed, some years ago, and it's supposed to have a lot of really interesting historical and archaeological displays about Ethiopia. That's probably a highlight of Addis. There's a great church that we got to visit that was built by Haile Selassie. He started it before the Italian occupation and then finished it after the Italians were ejected. But it's a really elaborate, beautiful church. His grave and that of his wife are both in the church. It's got these great stained glass windows that depict various scenes from the Old and New Testaments. So there's a stained glass window of Moses bringing down the Ten Commandments from Mount Sinai with the commandments written in Giz, which is their ancient language, and just a lot of other really interesting paintings on the inside of that church. There's an overlook that you can go to that you can see the entire city. It's a giant city. It's got 8 million people in it.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that large.
Yeah, and like many third world capitals, it has kind of a contrast. You'll see these brand new, gleaming concrete and glass buildings across the street from, someone herding a pack of mules down the road, carrying grain on their back. It's got all that kind of contrast in it. It's a very busy, vibrant city.
You gave me lots of pictures that I'll be using to illustrate this show. In fact, I had to stop trying to look at them while we were talking because I noticed every time I went to go to a new page, I would break up your audio, so my apologies for that. You took how many pictures over the whole 2.5 weeks?
Yeah, we took about 11,000, and of those, about 8,500 were shot in Ethiopia. It's a place where there's a picture opportunity around every corner because the people are very distinct. They're very colorful. They look unlike any other Africans that you're likely to run into because ethnically they have more in common with people from the Arabian Peninsula than people from sub-Saharan Africa. The architecture is unique. Scenes of daily living are interesting. There's beautiful scenery with mountains and things everywhere. And so, with no limit on the amount of pictures we could take, since we had the right kind of storage device, we took a lot of pictures.
And I found them captivating. Obviously, I'll put a link to your gallery in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. Any last words on Ethiopia?
I think it's a place that, for the right kind of traveler, is a very rewarding destination. It's got unique culture, very interesting history, ruins that go back all the way, in some instances, to the time of Christ, and really captivating people. So, for the right kind of traveler who likes to explore and discover something new, unique, and unusual, it's a destination I'd highly recommend.
Well, Chris, thanks again for being back on the show, and it sounds like we'll have you back sometime real soon now to talk about the other half of your trip. Thanks for being here.
Well, Chris, thank you for continuing to produce the podcast. I said it last time, and I'll say it again. It's a great service for the traveling community. I enjoy it as a listener, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to your listeners through the interview.
Well, thanks very much. If you haven't been watching the iTunes Enhanced version with all the pictures in it, I would suggest that you check out Chris's gallery of photos on the website, linked to from amateurtraveler.com. They really are very interesting to look at, and we will have Chris back on again, in fact, next week. By the time I've recorded this part, I've already recorded the second interview with him, talking about the rest of his trip to Uganda and Rwanda. I have one internet resource for you today because we're talking about adventure travel. It's a new site that someone just pointed out on the discussion boards at amateurtraveler.com/board, and that is Top World. Topworld.com is a site that has 10 adventure travel ideas for every country in the world. So something to check out, topworld.com. Remember, I still have a contest going on to encourage people to write iTunes reviews for the show. If you submit a review and then send me an email that verifies which review is yours, on the end of February I'm going to pick one at random and award an Amateur Traveler mug. Since I started recording this show, the Amateur Traveler has been featured on iTunes, and so this may in fact be the first show that you've heard. They're all this good. At least that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. I forgot to say, speaking of contests, I've been forgetting to include a picture on the enhanced version of Dave, who won the iPod Shuffle from the last contest. But if you have that version and you're looking at it, I've got a picture of Dave including the iPod Shuffle. You can't tell, but it's engraved on the back with amateurtraveler.com. And with that, I think we'll close the show. So if you have any comments, feel free to go to amateurtraveler.com and leave them on the website, or send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com, or even call the comment line at 206-MOM-LOVE. That's 206-MOM-LOVE. Look forward to hearing from you. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
The best and the brightest served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery, pod show, and limelight.